Keeping in mind the promises given to Abraham, that God would give him a place and a people and would be present among them, this chapter is absolutely devastating to read. It looks like the end of all those promises. And the question we are left asking at the end of it all is it all over for God's people? Is this the end of God's promise to save? This is how the end of Jerusalem was brought about. Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. That's the end of chapter 24. And so, unsurprisingly, the king of Babylon came back. He encamped around the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So, for 2 years then, the city was under siege. The situation became absolutely desperate for those inside Jerusalem, with no food left for them to eat. We read that at last the city wall was broken through by the Babylonian forces, at which point the army fled, trying to get out of the city, trying to cut their way to safety, but the Babylonian army pursued them, capturing the king in the plains of Jericho. The king of Judah was taken before the king of Babylon, where the sentence was pronounced. This was his punishment for rebelling against the Babylonian king. Verse 7, they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. They forced him to watch as his boys were slain. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. How brutal is that? The last thing he ever saw was the sons that he loved slain. How those images would be burned into his mind for the rest of his days and tortured his heart with a pain that no physical punishment could ever have inflicted upon him. We read that the commander of the Babylonian army really went to work on Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. They have been there now 3 times. They're not coming back a fourth. There is now no city wall that will ever require a siege to be brought against the people of Jerusalem ever again. A huge number of people are taken off into exile at this point, with the commander leaving behind only the poorest people to live in the land and work the vineyards and fields. Everything of any value is taken away, and all the wealth of Judah is stripped from it. We read that Nebuchadnezzar puts a man called Gedaliah in charge of Judah. You'll remember that every single king of Judah has been a descendant of David, except this man. He is not. And the people rightly rise up in rebellion against him. We read, Ishmael, who was of royal blood, came with 10 men and assassinated Gedaliah. Is this an uprising? Does this Ishmael have the power to restore prosperity to God's people? Well, the answer is no. He acts not out of a valiant desire for victory, but it seems out of pure vengeance. After killing this puppet king, he understands that he now is facing a fearful prospect of retaliation from Babylon. He and all the people, from verse 26, he and all the people, from the least to the greatest, together with the army officers, fled to Egypt for fear of the Babylonians. No human earthly power can turn around these terrible events. And we are left asking at the end of the book, has all hope been lost? Several things have been lost. The land has been lost. The people have fled. The people have been lost, dragged off into exile. The prosperity has certainly been lost. Everything of any earthly value has now been stolen away. The temple has been smashed to pieces and burned to dust. The walls of the city have been dragged down, and along with them, the safety and security of any who would seek to dwell within those boundaries. The whole point of the promise of Abraham was that God would dwell among his people, but we have seen they've scorned his grace and spat in his face. They've received now the punishment that their sins deserve, separated from the presence of God. And yet, even now, in the storyline of the scriptures, there is hope on the horizon. Why? Well, because in an ultimate sense, the meeting place of God and man is not a temple made of bricks, but the Son of God himself, who steps into the world to dwell among his people, to deal with the sin that separates us, to transform the hearts of those who have lived under the tyranny of evil and have indulged in it far too often themselves. Jesus is the great hope of this passage, because through him, all God's people will be granted a place in heaven, a beautiful, physical eternity that will never perish, spoil, or fade. Not only will they have a place, but they will be part of a people from every tribe, tongue, nation, and language, gathered together, not reluctantly, but triumphantly, gathered willingly in the name of King Jesus, a truly global family. And then at last, because of the work of Jesus, because he came to dwell among us and deal with our sin, we can dwell with him for all eternity. At last, God's people will be in God's place, enjoying God's presence forever and ever. The hope in the face of the horror of this chapter will not be found in any petty uprising, but in the glorious redemptive work of the Lord Jesus Christ, who truly defeats evil and sets us free from captivity and gives us everlasting prosperity with him.